It started as something innocent, just a curiosity, a side project to add an edge to my YouTube channel. I've always been into urban exploration, sharing hidden pieces of Washington, D.C. with my audience. The city has this strange energy, layers upon layers of history, politics, and in certain corners, secrets that even locals never notice. I'd been living here for a while when I noticed the symbols, though it feels almost foolish now to call them that. The first one I saw was on a wall near the Washington Monument, carved faintly into the stone, a strange shape that looked intentional but unmarked. Most people probably wouldn't give it a second look, but something about it made me stop. It was almost geometric, like a pattern I'd seen before but couldn't place, as if it was designed to blend in but still be found. At first, it seemed like a quirky find, a talking point for my channel. But then, I saw another symbol near the Capitol building, hidden in the stonework of a staircase, and another by an alley downtown. They weren't random graffiti or street art. They were carved into the buildings with a precision that suggested age. They were all distinct, too. Some had faint loops and curves, while others were sharp, almost jagged. It was like a code scattered across the city, inviting me to uncover it. The more I searched, the more I found. Each symbol had a distinct energy, like they were pieces of something bigger, drawing me in further with every discovery. I started tracing a map of them, pinning the locations on my phone to try and see the pattern. At first, the symbols didn't seem to follow any kind of logical order. But slowly, as I pinned more and more locations, I noticed they began to form a grid, stretching over blocks, even whole neighborhoods. The idea that there might be an overlooked design under DC thrilled me. Here I was, walking the same paths as thousands before me, but seeing something that no one else noticed, or maybe something people deliberately ignored. I mean, Washington, D.C. has always had its fair share of conspiracy theories, from hidden Masonic symbols to the alleged supernatural energy flowing through its streets. I figured I'd stumbled onto a cool mystery that no one had truly cracked yet. But it wasn't long before that thrill twisted into something else. After the first few weeks, I started noticing things. At first, it was my equipment. My phone would start glitching whenever I tried to record near certain symbols, strange distortions that felt unnatural, almost as if something was tampering with the footage. Entire chunks of video would vanish, or colors would bleed in ways that weren't possible, even with filters. The sound, too, had this weird hum at times, almost like an electric buzzing, but there was no source, no reason for it. I thought it was interference, maybe an old radio signal or a fault in the wiring, but it was happening too often, always in the same spots, around the same symbols. The first time it really scared me was late one night near an old church in the city. I'd been tracing symbols that led to a quiet residential street, and there, tucked into the side of a wall, I found a small archway leading down to what looked like a basement entrance. There was another symbol above the door, a jagged one that looked almost aggressive, like a warning. I was curious, too curious, I guess, so I turned on my flashlight and walked down the steps to check it out. The second my foot hit the bottom, the air changed. It was thick, heavy, like there was a weight in the room pressing down on everything. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shift on their own. Then I heard it, footsteps, echoing from somewhere in the dark, just faint enough that I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but close enough that I knew they were real. I froze, scanning the room, but all I saw were shadows and that symbol, glaring down at me from above the doorway. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they started, and the silence that followed was even worse. It was oppressive, like the room itself was alive, holding its breath, waiting for me to move. I left in a hurry. The encounter rattled me more than I wanted to admit. For days, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, the weight of the air, the sense that something had been watching, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Things only got worse from there. Over the next few days, the symbols started showing up in places I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought it was just me discovering new ones. But they began appearing in spots I was sure I'd already checked, almost as if they were following me, creeping into places I frequented, my local coffee shop, the park where I jogged, even near my apartment building. They weren't always obvious. Sometimes it would be a faint marking on a tree, or a scratched line on a lamppost. But they were there, and the more I noticed them, the more unsettled I felt. The real breaking point came a few weeks in when I found a lead on an abandoned access tunnel near an old government building. The location was isolated, a place no one would just stumble into. I waited until night, figuring the darkness would add to the atmosphere for my video. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was stale, and the silence, it wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt purposeful, like even the building itself was trying to keep something buried. I followed the tunnel deeper, my flashlight casting a narrow beam ahead. The walls were lined with faint markings scratched into the concrete, symbols that looked even older, more worn. My flashlight began to flicker again, and the further I went, the worse it got, until it was barely more than a dying ember. That's when I saw it, a small alcove with an old, crumbling altar-like structure. Symbols were etched all over it, layered on top of each other in a way that was chaotic, almost violent. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the screen went black, refusing to turn on no matter what I tried. Then I heard it, the footsteps again, this time slow, deliberate, echoing from somewhere behind me. I swung my flashlight around, but it was barely working, casting a weak, sputtering light that only made the shadows worse. The footsteps were getting closer, growing louder, each step steady, intentional, as if something was approaching with a purpose. My heart felt like it was going to burst, but I couldn't move, frozen in place by some unseen force. In a panic, I stumbled backward into the altar, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic. It was a small, dust-covered journal, wedged between the stones. I grabbed it on instinct, stuffing it into my bag as I forced my legs to move, practically sprinting out of the tunnel. But even as I left, the feeling lingered, like something was still watching, its eyes following me up the steps and out into the night. I didn't open the journal until I got home, locking the door and sitting at my desk with the lights all on. The cover was faded, the pages brittle, but I could still make out the writing. It was filled with notes from someone who had been tracing the same symbols decades ago, describing locations that matched the places I'd visited, and detailing strange, unexplainable events that only grew more intense with each entry. The entries grew darker, too. The writer mentioned hearing footsteps, seeing figures in the corner of his vision, feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. They described symbols that would appear in places they hadn't seen before, places they'd already checked. The last entry was short, scrawled with a frantic, shaky hand. It said, "The symbols, they're not just markers. They're a network, they're a trap. If you follow them, they follow you back." The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence. But everywhere I went, I started noticing shadows that seemed to linger a bit too long, movements in the reflections of windows and mirrors that didn't line up with anything around me. One night, as I walked home, I noticed a figure across the street, standing under a street lamp. He was staring straight at me, unmoving, his face hidden in shadow. I glanced away for a moment, and when I looked back, he was gone, but the feeling stayed. It was like there was an invisible thread connecting me to that figure, pulling tighter with every step I took. In the days that followed, the symbols showed up everywhere. They weren't just around the city anymore. They were etched into my mind, appearing even in my dreams. I'd see them carved into walls that stretched out endlessly, spiraling down dark corridors, twisting and turning, drawing me deeper and deeper. Every time I woke up, I'd feel that same oppressive silence, like the weight of the entire city was pressing down on me. The final straw came when I was editing footage one night. I froze the video at a random frame, and there, barely visible in the shadows behind me, was a faint, humanoid shape. I rewound and watched again, but the shape was gone, as if it had never been there. But I know what I saw. Since then, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that tunnel. The symbols, the silence, the shadows, they're all part of something much bigger, something that was never meant to be uncovered. I don't know what I tapped into, what network or ritual I'd disturbed, but it's too late to turn back. They say Washington, D.C. is built on secrets, that its architecture hides messages meant only for those who know how to look. I used to think that was just a story, a myth. But now, every time I walk through those streets, I see the symbols looping and spiraling like an invisible thread, leading me down paths I'm too afraid to follow but unable to escape. And sometimes in the corners of my vision, I see them, the shadows watching and waiting.
Please subscribe for more stories.